Have you really? Or are you
That's
just being
really
polite?
I was laughing because I realized everything's about perspective. When Dan was like, yeah, I was in Florida and it was nice. It was 35 degrees. I'm like, oh my God, that's nice. Here we are all complaining, going crazy. And then of course, if you compare it to Dubai, then I guess you can say.
Yeah, I mean, it was hot. I went up to Tallahassee at one point and I made the mistake of going for a walk. And I had, to be honest, thank God there was a pub around the corner from my hotel. So I went into the pub, had a cocktail, and it was all good. Anyway.
Yeah. I bet it was a fruity one. Did you have an umbrella in it and a sparkler?
It had a cherry in it. It was I think it was an old fashioned.
Oh.
Yeah, it was nice.
Yeah, nice.
I really got into cocktails when I was in Florida. I'm not really a cocktail person, but
okay.
Yeah. Anyway, sorry, I'm taking over the conversation.
You've changed. Just to clarify, Anna, this is Dan's last podcast. He's talking about eating cherries in cocktails and driving around in Mustang. It's just not the northern lad that we know anymore. What's happened to him?
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, it is really good to have you on the podcast, Anna. We have been trying to do this for about 2 years. I think we worked it out the other day. It's been about 2 years, and things being in the mix, being timetables and having a baby. Congratulations on that. And then writing a book and all the other stuff. Second baby. So it's like busy. And we are really, really glad to finally be able to get you on and discuss primarily today. We're going to be talking about your book, The Learning Game, which we've all got a copy of and we've read, and looking forward to talking about that. But for our listeners who don't know who you are, I wonder if you could just give us a little bit of a synopsis about you and how you came to writing this book.
Yeah, so my name's Anna. I'm originally from Panama, but growing up, I moved around a lot. By the time I was 14, I had been to 10 different schools in 7 different countries. And so when it comes to school, I like to say that, I've been around the block a lot, a few times. And so, as I've reflected on my whole journey and how I ended up here, I realized that, going to all these different schools and moving around so much really sparked that desire to work in education, but then at the same time, it's a springboard for wanting to reform and change a lot of the things that we've been doing for a long time. And so it's funny because in the book, I talk about the game of school and then the game of learning. And so the game of school is basically what I had to do in all these different schools that I went to growing up in order to keep up with all the academic environments and the expectations. And it was basically all the things that you do in order to appear diligent and attentive and not to get in trouble and sort of check the boxes in order to pass to the next grade level. And so I did all that of being quiet, not getting in trouble, not questioning my teacher, knowing when to raise my hand and when not to, et cetera, et cetera. And I was very good at this game, right? I got to do it over and over again. I was the new girl 10 times, but I didn't really enjoy it. What I did enjoy was all the things that I could do outside of school, right? And that's where real learning was happening for me when I was exploring my interests and really digging deep into the things that I wanted to learn more about and I was curious about, and nobody kind of like judging me with a grade or telling me, when it's time to close the book and move on to the next thing. And so my mom was really good at making sure that I got to explore and do all these things outside of school. And she was what I call the perfect enabler. And so whenever I had a productive interest in something, she was like, yes, let's do it. And so I think I grew up with that love for learning that came from outside of school, not necessarily inside school. And I loved working with people. And I had a natural way of explaining things in a way that captured people's attention according to what I heard growing up. And so I decided I wanted to become an educator. And when I was going through my studies in college, I had to do student teaching in several different placements in New York City, different grades, different schools. And that's when, it dawned on me when I was observing all the students that they were all playing the game of school. And I hadn't quite realized that the game was universal. And it was really concerning because these kids did not look excited to learn. These kids did not look like they were retaining any of the information that they were consuming. I didn't see this like spark in their eyes, especially the older ones, that you see in little kids, right? If you look at a little kid, they're so excited about everything. They want to learn about everything. They have so many questions. They're constantly exploring. They're not afraid to take risks. And then all that kind of starts to get lost as kids enter this structured environments and as they get older, right? And so I started to question a bunch of the things that we were doing. And I was like, but you know what? When I become a teacher, I'm going to do things differently in my classroom. And to an extent I did. I tried to create a student-centered environment. I taught in New York, Panama, and Boston. And, the kids were excited to come to my classroom. They seemed to enjoy writing and reading. And, I tried to deviate from the curriculum as much as I could. I mean, in order to kind of engage in the things that they were already curious about and excited about. And so, but it did get to a point where I realized as they move on to the next grade levels, even when they move on to great teachers, they start to lose that excitement for life. And so I realized like that's where we're stuck, right? A big problem in education is that kids are stuck in the game of school, imitating their teachers instead of thinking for themselves, solving textbook problems instead of engaging in real world problems where they can make real decisions and experience failure in a positive way where they can keep learning and, just going through the motions instead of really spending their time the best way possible. And so I decided, after 4 years of teaching, I don't really see my place in the system anymore. I kind of want to explore options outside the system and see how we can actually create learning experiences that kids are excited to be part of, that actually prepare them for this chaotic and ever-changing world that we live in. And I realized I couldn't do that inside the system. And so in 2019, I left and I started exploring all the different options and talking to a lot of people. I ended up joining a startup called Synthesis, which we can talk about, which is kind of like I went from being on one extreme, the traditional education system, to suddenly being like at the edge of innovation, something that I had like, whoa, it would just constantly blow my mind, the kind of things that we were experimenting and that we are experimenting with. And I feel very optimistic about the future of education and where we're going. We still have a long way to go, but basically all this research and all these questions that I had when I left the school system and all these things that I've been doing for the past years turned into The Learning Game, which is the book that came out last week that you guys read. And so it's not a scripted book. It's more of an invitation to rethink education for yourself and to start asking the kinds of questions that hopefully will make things move in a different direction and return to, the things that, again, make kids excited to learn and how to capitalize on those. So that's a long answer to explain who I am and what I'm doing now.
That's really cool. And I think that's where I first heard of you, like probably a couple of years ago when because we had Josh on the podcast, and Josh spoke at our annual awards event as well, and he was absolutely fantastic, and always been captivated by Josh's story, and just kind of that whole, and you're talking about being at the kind of the edges of education and exploring and innovating, and I think that's kind of our podcast is three guys who are captivated by the edges of education, and it's kind of what we do and why we wanted you on for a few years, really, because we want to hear from those at those edges who are experimenting, because I think the kind of circles we mix in, the traditional education circles, which and will have been part of, literally don't know anything about the edges. They don't know. They're so, and I often say teachers are so busy with things in their classrooms, they can't look out of the window, they can't see what's on the horizon. There's so much going on within their classrooms. And I kind of see it. I don't know how you feel as being somebody who's part of Synthesis, that's kind of building momentum, but I kind of see it coming to there's going to be some kind of crux point, I think, where we're going to have real alternatives to the mainstream education. And someone like me, I grew up on an estate in the northeast of England. Our only choice was we went to the local school at the end of the street. We then went a couple of miles away to the high school. Literally the only choice. That school did not have to compete. And most of the education system has never had to deal with competition. And competition drives innovation. I kind of say like schools like Synthesis, and we've had guys from Sora on and other schools that are kind of pushing those boundaries. The more and more you guys start to gain momentum, and the average parents around the world start to hear about it as a real alternative, and competition starts growing, and I really see us getting to a point where the education system's gonna have to adapt. It's gonna have to adapt. But I guess I don't really have a question, so I'm gonna think of a question now. But I guess, what's it like to be within that environment where you are kind of you're seeing from within innovation happening, that kind of that non-linear innovation where you're trying to change education, and I guess it's the epitome of your book, really. How do you see this going? How do you see it being fulfilled? Is it always going to be a niche area, or do you see it kind of becoming a more of a mainstream alternative?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question, and I actually think a little bit different from you in terms of like what's going to happen with the actual education system. Like, and again, happy to be wrong about this. I hope I'm wrong about this, but I actually don't think that traditional school systems are going to go anywhere. At least not, while we're around. And the reason is because, the more research I do and I go way back, and you start to kind of like see how this works and why are things the way they do and who's making the decisions and who's coming up with this curriculums. And you start to notice all the bureaucracy and how much, and apologies because my headphone keeps falling off, but how much of politics influence what's going on, at least a lot in the United States. And the reality is that most parents right now, they have to work and they have to drop their kids off somewhere that's quote unquote safe. And I say quote unquote because that has been changing a lot, unfortunately, recently. But and so right now saying this all these alternatives, they do require a little bit more of engagement on the parents' side, and a lot of families are not there. And so that's one thing. And the other thing is, like I said, it's a very old entity, and there's a lot of forces within it, and a lot of things that I find it really hard for it to move in a different direction. I find it really hard for it to be sort of reformed. I feel like the only option is for us to create an alternative system that sort of goes in parallel and create what you were saying, Dan, that competition. But it's sort of like, I feel like it's always going to be there. So hopefully I'm wrong, but that's sort of like where I've come to with the information that I have right now.
I kind of take I spend a lot of my times in traditional schools trying to convince them to change. So I've had to adopt an optimistic mindset that something will change. So that's the angle I'm coming from.
It's funny because when I say like, oh, look at all the industries and how much they've changed in the past 200 years, and yet you look at education and it's pretty much the same. And some people are like, no, like look at the smart boards and look at the iPads and look at all that technology. And I'm like, yeah, but that's not innovation. You're just kind of grabbing a little bit of tech and adding it to the classroom. The results are pretty much the same. Like maybe the teacher's job is a little bit easier because she has this app where it's easy to track students, or maybe the kids, can memorize faster some of the content for the test because they have this like adaptive apps. And so, but we're not really changing the root of the problem. So I think that, civilization advances only to the extent that people learn how to think for themselves and how to work collaboratively to solve complex problems. And so the lack of an education system that nurtures and teaches these things, it's therefore one of our primary bottlenecks, right? And I don't think that again, that's going to change. Like maybe, yes, they will start adopting some of the things that educators outside the system are doing that they see that are, and we can talk about, the AI tutors that are out there. I think that those will make their way into classrooms, for example. So I think that they will continue to add on stuff, but I don't think that they're necessarily fundamentally going to change. And so I think that what we need to do is really create a system from the ground up, rethinking education from first principles, which is something I talk about in my book a lot, right? Which means just like going back to the root of, and Josh, who you've had, who's one of the educators that I admire the most, he talks very well about this. Like we need to go back to asking the right kind of questions, like what makes kids excited to learn? Like what's the best way to spend their time? What do we know about kids and how they learn, right? We know that they are actually, enthralled with challenges and complexity, even though in school we hear the opposite, right? And so we know that they want the real thing, right? They don't want watered down word problems in textbooks. Like they want to actually make real decisions and sort of like shoulder the consequences of those decisions and ask the right kind of questions and like all these things. And so how can we then create learning experiences that nourish and that, cultivate these skills that come naturally to kids?